Stand by for liftoff.
3, 2, 1.
Hey guys, welcome back to yet another video on Balloon Hit Productions. I'm your host as usual for this time around. My name is Marcelo Nostroza, and I'd like to welcome you to my review for episode 2 of For All Mankind season 1, entitled He Built the Saturn V. But guys, as usual, for all of my For All Mankind discussions, I will not be alone on this journey through space and beyond. I'll just be joined by my friend Dan Decker. Welcome to the channel again, Dan. It's a pleasure to have you here.
All right, here we are, man. Thanks so much. With that great introduction, I'm going to go ahead and provide you all with the synopsis, get us started with the basics, and then we'll go through plot-wise as we have and break this thing down. So in this episode, the show continues to explore the implications of the Soviet Union's success in landing the first man on the moon before the United States. The characters that we have come to know grapple with the shock and fallout from this alternate history event, prompting NASA to push the boundaries of their ambitions and technology. This episode delves into the personal and professional lives of the NASA engineers and astronauts as they face the challenges of catching up with the Soviets. We see the introduction of new characters who bring fresh dynamics to an existing team. And this includes some who are motivated by patriotism and others who are driven by personal goals. As the pressure mounts at NASA to innovate and succeed, intense moments of both conflict and camaraderie, this episode beautifully captures the air's tension and excitement for setting the stage for a high-stakes space race that defines the series. So that's a very broad thing. We get into the nut and bolt of it is we left off last episode having landed on the moon. Now we got to get them back.
Yeah, I really love how this first episode starts off with a TV broadcast of Warner Braun basically explaining how space travel works and basically explaining how NASA gets fuel into the ship to make the journey to the moon. I really think it's a really creative way to start the episode, in that this episode essentially is the fall of a really prominent real life space figure.
Right.
And this made me, after watching this episode, this made me actually look up the history of the real life person to see if he had any leanings that way, or if that was just a fabrication of the show. Anyway, I thought it was a really interesting framing device to start out this episode. Before we get to the cliffhanger from the pilot, I just would like you to address the opening sort of TV footage of Warner. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, and absolutely. And for someone of my vintage and my fellow compatriots from the early 80s, a lot of these film reels, as they were presented, were still in our school archives. Like, you could go pull that reel and watch von Braun deliver that information. It was and at the time, in the context of it, it was interesting because, of course, we had already landed on the moon by the time I was in school. So seeing what the thought process was leading up to what actually got us there, how much was similar, how much was different. But yeah, leading into the fact that, hey, 90% of what it takes to get us there is just the fuel to get off the planet. But it introduced him in a way that I think a lot of real world Americans at the time, that's how they knew him. His history and how he came to be, part of our space history has there's a lot of depth to that for him as a real person too.
I just thought it was a really interesting way to, like I said before, frame the episode and really tell the audience sort of stealthily that this episode is going to be about this guy, but we're not like going to hit you over the head with it off the bat. We're going to slowly, ease you into it. And at the end of the day, this is actually one of the best early episodes of For All Mankind, because in the pilot, Warner Braun is really set out to be an important figure, not only this alternate universe, but for NASA. And this figure, Warner Braun, is the idol of one of our main characters. And if you think about where she goes, the parallels of her mentor story and the
Mhm.
parallels of where she goes, which we'll not talk about here. We'll get to that, but further down the road, is really, really interesting. So now let's move on to the cliffhanger from last week. So they have figured out a way to get off the moon. And I love how Gene Kranz, one of our favorites here,
Absolutely.
is really, really like he's actually concerned. And he brings it up to Warner Braun, and Warner says, well, this will technically work. Of course, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah,
He goes,
exactly.
but he goes, this will technically work. And I just love Warner Braun's confidence in that moment. But I also found it really interesting that Gene Kranz, because in the last episode he was very assured of himself, and he was very, I'm the leader and I'm going to lead us through this crisis. But it was very unusual for me to see Gene like this. So I was wondering what your thoughts on a specific moment was.
This and it was Gene as in the show and as a historical figure. His top priority is astronaut safety,
Mhm.
and so he has questions, I think, based on while he may understand um, the rudimentary mechanics of the conversation, he doesn't understand necessarily the deeper math that someone like von Braun would have done to understand the fuel economy versus angle of ascent, et cetera, and so on. So he's trusting in the experts to tell him this will work, and he doesn't get an 100% answer. He gets the answer of it's a solid plan. Yeah, there's a lot of solid plans, but Gene works in absolutes, and so I think versus how the landing went that led to them being akimbo and it being a bit of a struggle to perhaps relaunch the ascent stage. Um, that was in Neil's hands. And so was this, ultimately. But I feel like it was more of going in with a controlled set of variables that ended up being, offset by uncontrollable variables, where this is a lot of unknowns into an unknown, right? Lifting off the moon the way they have to is going to be an interesting bit.
But you are totally right in that Warner would know the real map behind it, and Gene would only understand to a point. So after hearing you say that, I totally understand where Gene was coming from. But at the time when I rewatched this episode for the first time, and today when I rewatched it for this conversation, I was kind of like I was still kind of not looking at all the angles of the scene until you just brought them up there, and I was like, oh well, now I see it. It's really a question of an individual driving himself by his gut,
Mm-hmm.
Gene,
Yep.
and somebody like Warner driving himself by his intuition and his intellect.
Gene's trepidation is such that these astronauts' lives are in his hands,
Right.
but now they're not, right? It was his call to get them on the moon, and it's his call to get them off, but he has to trust their lives to von Braun's intellect, like you just said, and that is where I think he's uneasy.
The next thing that we see, we jump forward 2 months, and Ed, God bless him, is lying in bed with his beautiful wife Karen, and
Mm-hmm.
he's looking at the roof
The
of his
leaking
bedroom,
roof.
the leaky roof of his bedroom. And then we cut to a scene of Ed in the lobby of NASA, and we see Warner, Deke, and a bunch of other folks come in.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed basically confronts Deke in the middle of the lobby. He goes, I've been in the doghouse for 2 months, and when are you going to let me out? And Deke just slightly says, okay, well, here's the deal. As long as this guy, Warner, is in charge of the astronaut program, you aren't going to fly. But after that scene, I find it really interesting that this happens a little bit later on. Ed actually meets with a commander from the Navy, and he considers leaving NASA and going to the Navy. So, what do you think about Ed's situation and his dilemma in this episode?
Ed needs a action challenge, let's call it. Ed is driven by a do and not a sit there. He's at that desk. They show really well how miserable he is with the fact that his pencil breaks, and he gets so frustrated that he punches the wall. And then he does challenge Deke to, what do I got to do to get back on the rocket? And his desire kind of, they kind of come off of the discussion from the previous episode where Karen is talking to him about his options if he leaves NASA, or if they let him go because of the interview thing. And so he's entertaining that. They obviously want him back. That commander seemed pretty excited at the prospect of it. But we know in the end it's not the right fit for Ed, but he's frustrated at not doing. He wants to be hands-on, and running this desk, flying this desk is not it.
I mean, one of the interesting things that is said in that meeting with his old army buddy at the outpost, one of the interesting things that he points out is usually officers or commanders go from the Air Force to NASA, not the other way around.
Right.
So it's to me it just screamed of desperation from Ed. Like you said, he doesn't know he doesn't know what to do. Ed is not an individual that will sit and do calculations for eons waiting to be called. He's a fucking pilot.
Right.
He would rather be up there than rotting in some back room in NASA doing.
It was almost a closet.
Yeah.
It was a really small room.
Almost a closet. Almost a closet.
Really small.
But this brings me to another issue that I think is very, very interesting. At this point, the president wants to stick it to the Russians. And the way that he wants to stick it to the Russians is he wants to be the first person to build an active moon base on the surface of the moon. So we have a very, very interesting scene between the government representative, Mr. Payne, Deke, and Warner, and a bunch of other folks in a room. And in the scene, basically, Mr. Payne says to von Braun, we have to accelerate our plans. We have to go faster, and we have to build a new rocket so we can find a place on the moon to build our moon base. And I really like what von Braun's position is in this situation, because he's like, I will not be a part of my weapons being used in a negative manner again. That is not what this is about. I do not want space to be weaponized. And that's really interesting to me, because that's an idea that I floated in our pilot discussion, where I go, okay, it's all well good intentions between the US and the Soviet Union to beat each other to get to the moon, but once they get there, what's going to happen? The same thing that happened on our blue marble here that we love so much and that we live on is going to happen in space.
Yep. So
I'm like, it's the same bullshit. The only thing is, here we're on the ground, but up there we're floating.
Yeah.
So,
right.
So it was really interesting to me that even this early on in the series, the potential of a war in space eventually happening was actually floated here. So what did you think about that scene, and what did you think about Warner's position on his weapons not being used in a militaristic way?
The contrast with where he is by the end of the episode, it feels very maybe even guilt motivated, because under the development of his rockets through Nazi Germany, he saw what he even states in this, that I developed that rocket. He used a different name even. I developed that rocket for low Earth orbit, and they turned it into the V2. And that's his case. I don't want to see these things turned into weapons. And because in real history, it already had some of the rockets that put Americans into orbit early on were also the first ballistic missiles that we used with nuclear warheads. So, it was almost like a joint development. So he continued to kind of see what that would lead to. And again, contrasting with where we see it ends up by the end of the episode, I feel like he's probably bearing a significant amount of guilt around that, as we'll come to learn for reasons.
Yeah, I mean, look, in my opinion, I think he's short-sighted.
Yeah.
Because he has to understand that he is a scientist. He is a man of science, right? And he has to understand that there's a bigger machine at work here. And no matter what he says,
Oh, he's
America's
idealistic. Yeah.
he's idealistic. And no matter what he says, he has to know in the back of his head to some extent that no matter what he says or no matter what his position is, his boss is the president, and the president outranks him, and the president outranks everybody in
Right.
this situation. So whatever he says is going to happen. I think that this is the conversation that that ultimately led to his downfall, because his position in this conversation gets back to the president, and in a brilliant use of actual footage again by the For All Man team, editing team, the production team, like the way that they handle old timey footage and old recordings of President Nixon is just fascinating. Anyway, in this recording, we find out that President Nixon is not too pleased with Warner's position on basically weaponizing the moon, and he wants to find a way to force him out. So, just real quickly, what do you think of the way that the For All Mankind production again used actual recordings of President Nixon to drive a story point home that they needed to drive home?
It's very crafty, as they always manage to do. It's woven in a way that it's becoming, and as you and I know, as the show goes on, it becomes increasingly more difficult to separate how they're using actual historical items and footage and photos from what is the altered history from what was the real history. And the way they handle Nixon through this is one of the indicators of that, because like I said previously, we have a lot of audio from Nixon due to the fact that he recorded almost every conversation. So there's a lot to work from. And I wouldn't go so far as to say, given the time of production for the show itself, it's been a few years now. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was driven by any kind of language learning model or something that might have make sentences that didn't exist. But the audio engineers obviously, or they got a really good impersonator. But the way that they show us photographs, they had a picture of Henry Kissinger, so on and et cetera. It's always really well done. It's part of the art, and it's an excellent tool, part of the storytelling.
So the next scene that I would like to drive us to is a really, really, really short, but I think important scene, and it's just a scene of Karen and Ed talking in their living room, and basically Karen is giving Ed the 9th degree again. I love Karen because she's got so much moxie.
Very smart.
And Ed is basically, complaining about, this is all about me, I. It's all about me, right? And I love what Karen says when Ed stops, when Ed steps down from his soapbox. This scene really annoyed me because of Ed's reaction when Karen said this. She goes, it's not all about you. It's about us.
Right.
And I'm like, and Ed stops for a second. He looks over at his wife, and the look that he gives Karen, I'm like, I want to hit him. Because look, I know it's the conventions of the time, but I'm like, good for God's sakes, Ed, what do you think that she's good for? Just for having children and just for cooking your meals? Good God, man.
I think Ed, and again, speaking of things that we see here that play out, why he ends up coming back, and we'll come to that story as part of this. But Karen specifically, here I am making it all about Ed. Karen specifically.
You said the name you did.
But he forgets, because he is self-absorbed, and he has the hero complex, which, oh my God, we see that grow. But he has that hero complex. He's a good but flawed person, and they all are, honestly. But we see him kind of come to the remember part of, oh right, I didn't just marry this woman to be a mother and a cook. He remembers that he partnered with her, that he married her because she's whip smart and she keeps him on track. And so every now and then she has to snap that leash. He sees himself on free reign. She's got a little, and she'll snap that leash back when it's time to get Ed in line. And he respects that, but it caught his attention. Like you said, it was kind of like his first reaction was, "Woman, what are you trying to say to me?" And then, as he processed where she was coming from, he realized, oh yeah, well, typically she's right. So, because that's smart too. But yeah, Karen is one of my favorite characters, flaws included.
Yeah, and look, and if you guys are watching these discussions because you're making your way through the show for the first time, no spoilers here. But what Karen goes through later in the season is 10 times worse than dealing with this menial stuff. I'll just say that much. The next scene that I would like to move us to is kind of in the same vein. So Tracy is at home dealing with her young kids. Now Tracy
Yep.
is Gordo's wife, and Tracy Tracy decides to call Gordo, who is on some maneuvers, flying some plane or something. And Gordo picks up the phone, blackout drunk, and he
Mhm.
doesn't know which side is up. And the reason that Tracy's calling him is because she needs to change some tubes in the TV that they have because it broke. And while she's talking to Gordo over the phone, the sound of a toilet flushing in the hotel that Gordo is in, indicating that Gordo is cheating on Tracy. And to which I said,
Mhm.
"You fucking moron, you
Yeah.
idiot, you bastard." That really bothers me because I hate people who are not loyal to their spouses. That drives me up a wall.
Indeed.
And as much as I love Gordo, but I that always pissed me off. It always pissed me off that Gordo is a drunk, and it always made me angry. So what do you think about that scene, and what do you think about the way that Tracy handled it in the moment? Because we'll get to what she does later on in a
Right.
second, but just based on that.
Um, it's heartbreaking to watch because you can see Trace's heartbreaking, right?
Ugh,
She loves Gordo, and I think too Gordo loves her regardless of his actions. He's no excuses, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't love his wife. It just means that he's unfaithful. Uh,
right.
there's a whole discussion about that otherwise. But what, to the point, like these days, someone hearing the toilet flush over the telephone, perhaps somebody's being a little more rude than they need to, but you can take your
Right.
phone to the restroom with you.
Yeah.
In the 60s, there were there were hotels who, oh wait, that's cool.
Yeah.
There were hotels that would have had a telephone in the restroom as part of their, that
Oh,
was
really?
something
I
that,
didn't
yeah,
know that.
it could happen, but it wasn't common. And so, that's the clue. She knows someone else is in the room because the phone's not going to reach. Gordo's not doing business. He's obviously just woken up, so she knows he's not the one in there.
Mhm.
And but her reaction in the moment is obviously, I think it's more of resignment to the confirmation of her suspicions, right? Until then, until that moment when she heard, someone else flushing the toilet, she could ignore it, right? She could let him lie about it. But now, if she's not an idiot, right? She's not stupid. And so if she continues to accept the lie, then that shows her to be an idiot and to be stupid. And that's where I think, and it's not even really disappointment in Gordon or Gordo as much as it is um, disappointment in herself for not accepting the truth she probably already knew, and
Mhm.
this just confirmed it for her. So yeah, and we know through the rest of the story how strong this woman turns out to be. So
Mhm. Just a quick word on Gordo, and I want to get your take on this.
Mm-hmm.
You just said, and just to be clear, before I say this, I believe in Gordo, and I believe that he loves his wife. But
Right. But
why do you think Gordo has that problem? Do you think he's just like? Do you think he's one of those? He just has something about him that he doesn't feel like he's worthy enough. That's why he drinks so much.
I think that, first of all, in the time, casual alcoholism was a lot more prominent.
Acceptable.
Yeah, like social smoking and things that we see in here that we don't do anymore. You don't smoke at your job at the desk in a conference room or any of the things. But yeah, functional alcoholism was a lot more hidden then and taboo as well. But I think too, for Gordo and for a lot of these guys, like they're test pilots. Part of their psyche, part of the makeup of who they are is to be challenged with thrill seeking. And if he's not flying a jet or riding a rocket, his thrill seeking is not just the engaging with the escort or whatever she was on that level, but also the thrill of hiding it, right? The thrill of
Right.
the lie, of the getting away with it because I'm this person and I can do this, and definitely a sense of entitlement. But they've been given that by these are the astronauts that came into the hard charging and rough riding rocket men, and they're having a transition into this softer era of PR astronauts, right? Publicly relatable astronauts. And that's I feel like they probably weren't told that.
Hmm.
And that's but Gordo and all of them, but Gordo is a thrill seeker,
Yeah.
and I think that's where this compunction comes from.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, Gordo turns out to be the most emotional one of them all. Because his story really goes in interesting places as the seasons go on here, pushing us forward again now to there's a really funny scene. Well, I find it funny, but I find it funny, but it's not play for laughs, and that really shows you where my sense of humor is. But poor Karen pulls up to Gordo's house, and on Gordo's front lawn is all sorts of shit. Somebody's having a fucking hissy fit, and it turns out to be Tracy because she has had it with Gordo, and she's having a fucking flip out session.
Yep.
And on the front yard, on the front lawn is another one of the wives waiting for Karen to show up. So Karen gets there, takes a bunch of stuff that this other wonderful wife has, and goes into the house and basically assesses the situation and assesses where Tracy is. And she is
Yep.
out of her mind, fucking crazy. She's pulling off shit off the wall, and she basically breaks down
Yep.
in in Karen's arms. And what happens next is basically a scene of them sitting down on a couch, smoking. God bless them. I love women who smoke. Talking about the advantages of divorcing Gordo or the disadvantages of that.
Right.
And I really think that the position that the writers give Karen in this moment is really interesting, because Karen says, okay, if you divorce Gordo, the pressure that you're going to put on your family is just going to be immense. There's going to be press everywhere. They're gonna they're gonna put they're basically going to put your dirty laundry for the whole world out to see. Your
Yep.
kids are going to be photographed. So is that worth it? You divorcing him? And she also drives home the point that if you can't look at me right now with a straight face and tell me that you don't love him, then maybe this is not the direction for you to go in. So, what do you think about that whole sequence of Tracy losing her mind and then that conversation that Karen has with Tracy about weighing the situations or weighing the positives and negatives of divorcing Gordo at some point?
I would say that, again, Karen shows herself to be because she has to draw Tracy out of herself. Tracy's focused on her feelings, what this has done to her, and how it's affecting her. rather than the bigger picture. So again, Karen is the one to pull someone away from themselves into the bigger picture and draw, like you said, the contrast to here's where your life is now, and here's where your life's going to be if you do this. And, because it will have consequence. What I took away, though, from her challenge, and to flow back to the very beginning of the scene, Tracy's reaction is justified.
Yeah,
And
100%.
that more so than like she's not taking it out on the kids, right?
Yeah,
Or
no.
destroying actual parts of the house. She's breaking things in the house, physical, pictures of them, et cetera, and so on, and putting his crap out on the lawn, like you said. And that is 100% because that's, she's done with him at that point. Like this is, and raw emotion is not, so we don't shame raw emotion. We learn how we help people process it, and that's where Karen comes in and says, hey, this is, you got it. This is right. It's not right. Here's where we are. Are you prepared for the consequence of this? And you should only go down this road if you are 100% sure that you do not love him. But what I see on Tracy's face isn't a resolve that she is in love with Gordo. I think she still loves him, but it's more of she accepts her position for now, right? I thought the look that she gives it was more of a neutral acceptance and kind of like, okay, well, you're right, but now I know I need to make a plan, right? I can't recall exactly what are the next parts of Gordo and Stacey or Tracy's relationship from this jumping off point. I mean, when he comes home, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I mean, deeper into the show. So again, I'll be interested to see or be reminded where this goes. But for right now, I feel like she's like, okay, well, this is what, I don't want to do this to my family, but Gordo's on notice.
I find it really interesting that Karen says at one point while she's trying to weigh the options of what could happen here if they go this way or if they go that way, and by they I mean Tracy, she goes, how are you going to support yourself? How are you going to do it with two kids? And I'm like, well, her hands aren't broken, so she could work,
Right. She can get a job.
but you guys got to remember where we are. These women who are smart, intelligent, or beautiful, they're astronaut wives, and they're not expected to work.
Right.
So that's the whole, that's the whole societal point of view. But I bet if she had to, she could get a job.
Oh, easily. Yeah. No, she's not incapable.
Yeah.
But right. And I think that part, those are the questions that set her face, so to speak. Those are the questions where she was like, oh, not only is it broader than myself, also logistically, there are things that need to be in place before I do this. And Karen kind of points out, hey, you can't do it without these things. So what are you going to do?
Let's move to when Gordo, the master of the house, dickhead, comes back home. And Gordo comes back home nice and relaxed, and well. Before he comes back home, there's a really quick scene of him flying a plane with another pilot, and I love it because first of all, it's really cool to see the astronauts actually flying planes. I believe it's the first time we do have a scene like this in the series, and it's really cool that Gordo does the Tom Cruise remover of let's buzz the tower.
He buzzes his house.
Yes, instead of buzzing his house, instead of buzzing his tower, Dan said it right there. He buzzes his house, and when he does that, the director of this episode does a really quick shot of the inside of Gordo's house, and Tracy's there sitting at a desk, and she's stewing, and she just says, "Really, matter of factly, boys, Daddy's home."
Daddy's home.
And I'm like,
right.
That's such a cool thing to do, but. Moving forward now, when Gordo comes home, he has two gifts for his two kids. He has like a thing for his littlest kid and a bigger thing for his bigger kid.
Yep.
And he just says to Tracy, "It's really nice to see you. What are you cooking?" And the look on Tracy's face. She doesn't say much,
Mm-mm.
but the look on her face is like, he's like, motherfucker, I know what you've been doing, and I'm going to make you suffer, but I'm going to make you suffer in a very unique way.
Right.
I can't remember if she actually goes through with that, but just the look on her face in that moment goes, I know what you've done, motherfucker, and I'm going to make you pay. So, so what do you think about the way that she handled that?
Oh, just reminding him, like you said, that you're not getting this. This isn't forgiveness. You're not getting off the hook, buddy.
Right.
And that kind of, and it speaks a lot to him. The two things that we see there, it speaks a lot to the fact that he did the buzz, right? He flew by, he did the flyby, and then swantered in. I think maybe halfway expecting everything to just be kind of okay, you know. And she was there to remind him that no, things are not okay. But we're going to do business as usual for the children right now. And I think that's kind of where it was at, just kind of checking him. He comes
Mhm.
in, he comes in with these expectations that, no harm, no foul, so to speak. And she's like, no, sir, that's not how this goes.
Right. Do you think that he forgot?
Maybe I mean, it's not outside because I mean, when he's on the phone with her, cut back to the hotel scene where he was outed. The first thing he does after answering the telephone is grab the leftover beer from the night before and slug it down. So he could have very well just been too drunk to remember,
Right.
as it were, because he was not, but still no excuses. And
Right.
I just think that speaks to the mindset, like we've talked about a couple of times, the mindset of the era that it's set in, that
Mhm.
60s era of husband always right, woman take your place kind of thing.
Mhm. Okay, now I would like to focus on a really big moment for one of our characters in this episode. One of my favorites, Margot Madison. So Margot has a interview with Gene Kranz to become the first woman in mission control, right? The
Yep.
first woman in the trenches. And I love the moment when she's being interviewed by Gene and the things that Gene says. He goes, "If I give you this job, are you going to be able to handle the intense pressures while you're in there in the trenches? And how do I know if I give you this job? How do I know that you aren't going to run off on me and have children?" And I really love Margot's reaction because she goes, "Um, I don't think that's in the cards for me, sir." Like the way that she said, well, first of all, the actress who plays Margot, her name is escaping me at this point. I'm not
Hmm.
good with actors' names, so you'll have to forgive me, guys. But like her initial reaction to Gene's comments of, "Oh, you don't have children," and because he says at one point, "What do you do in your free time?"
Yeah.
And she doesn't really have an answer for him. But it's like she goes, "Look, I know I'm not your typical woman, but I'm like, how dare you say that I'm never gonna have kids?" Even if she doesn't want to, I found the way that she reacted to that statement by Gene was very, very interesting. So yeah, I listen, I just think it's a really, really great scene. And it also really shows that this world is surrounded by men who believe that they're entitled, and this world is surrounded by men who believe they're above their girlfriends or their wives.
Right.
But Gene Kranz has always treated women in this series, at least by what we've seen, with respect and almost a level of equalness. And
Right.
I've really enjoyed that about him. And the other thing that we learned is we learned a little bit more about how Werner was a part of Margot's life early on, and we learned that Warner is the reason that Margot became the individual who she is.
Right.
Became the individual that she is. So, what do you think about that interview scene with Gene Kranz?
So, a couple of things that you mentioned reminded me, and we didn't actually mention this at the top of the episode, that we begin this episode after Warner von Braun's, introduction to how the moon rocket would work. We'll go
Right.
through the show's intro, and then the next thing we come back to our familiar Walter Cronkite-esque newscaster who is they're broadcasting yet another landing, a Russian landing on the moon, and we get the first
Oh yeah,
woman on
that's
the
right.
moon,
Oh
right?
yeah, shit, I forgot
And
that. My bad.
so, no, because thinking about what you were saying in regards to this interview and, Margot being a woman and how Gene approaches it, and it just dawned on me while we were having this conversation, which is great podcasting, that some of Gene's motivation may have been driven by the fact that the Russians put a woman on the moon. So the easiest next thing, not to take anything at all away from Margot's capabilities, absolutely the right choice, regardless of Gene's motivations. She's capable as an engineer. She proves herself in those regards, time and again. But it could have very well been part of Gene's motivation to say, yeah, well, we've got we've got the first female flight director, or whatever it is, woman in mission control. And so kind of missing that point for myself, to see that correlation between starting the episode with the first woman on the moon, and presumably the first woman in space in this timeline. Maybe not, because I think the Russians put a woman in space shortly after. We'll come back to that as a historical point. Anyway, just kind of drawing that point, but Jean says something to her that kind of leaves it hanging in the air with whether or not she got the job. And that is, not every woman's cut out to be a mother. And it cuts, man. It's a cut line. And she kind of, she's not, I don't think she's offended in that he's not wrong so much that, maybe she would be a good mother. And we get to see her be a mother figure with Aleda in the future. But she has to kind of accept it because she kind of sees that for herself. But she's not offended. She's just surprised he said it out loud, I think.
To me, that played off as Margot going, "Wait a minute, I am very, 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 I'm very, very dedicated to my work," which she obviously is. I mean, you and I said it in our discussion of the pilot. She sleeps in the office.
Yeah.
So this is her life. But to me, that moment played as kind of insulting, but it could have played off as, kind of like, the moment could have played the way that Dan suggested it as well. So, but I really like the scene because it really shows that whatever the reason may be, because of whatever the reason may be of the Russians landing a woman on the moon first, or because maybe if that didn't happen, maybe NASA would have been forefront thinking and eventually thought, hey, it might be a good idea to have a woman as a part of our mission control.
Right.
I don't think that would have been the case, but I like to believe that would have been the case. The other fascinating thing about this episode is that a congressman comes to NASA because this congressman wants to have a hearing about the failed. You're gonna have to help me, Dan. The failed. What mission was it?
When they Apollo 10
yes.
when was a test run to test the orbital, in the first half of the descent to the moon, and
Yes.
that's the point where Ed, previous episode, spoke out of school about NASA not having guts, and this is where some of that comes home to roost.
Right.
A little.
Right. This is the first hearing. So just a really quick point here. I love the character actor who they get to play the senator.
Yeah. Saul Rubinek.
Yeah, Saul Rubinek. Thank you. This character actor has been in Frasier. He was already on Warehouse 13. Yeah, man, awesome. I absolutely love Warehouse 13. But I absolutely love the first hearing in this episode, and the reason why I say hearings is because there's one more. Because this hearing really serves as a two-pronged attempt. Number one is to talk about the failure of the test flight, but in a subtly secretive way, they use this hearing as a way to kind of kind of show us the failure of the upper management of NASA.
Right.
And I really like that in the hearing, before Ed makes his statement, he looks over at Karen just for a moment and he really weighs his options and he goes, okay, what am I going to do here? Am I going to bury myself in the hole even deeper? Or am I going to be, for the first time in this series, really honest and tell them what really happened and
Exactly.
explain to them why it happened? And I would just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. This is where, you know, this is where Ed shows the nature of his inner character. Ed is a patriot. He is a man of duty and honor. You know, they mentioned in the last episode you have to pick two. Well, Ed finds a way to pick all three. You know, duty, honor, and country. And what where he is telling both truths, right? Yes, I could have. We could have. There was very little difference between the ship I flew and the ship that landed on the moon. And ultimately, and they're like, well, Von Braun said don't do it. And Ed says, you know, once we're past liftoff, it's my ship to command. So I mean, and think about it, I mean, we've heard it a couple times, 250,000 miles away. What are they gonna do? Take away your birthday? I mean, you do what you want, and so but Ed decided to support the organization and the process that NASA had decided, because he lost friends in Apollo 1. And that's the whole reason they're taking their time and doing tests and test runs and coming back. So, on the books, Apollo 10 wasn't a failure because it accomplished their mission the way, and it came away from that mission with, appropriate data. They learned what they needed to learn, et cetera, and so on. And it set up Apollo 11. Just in this timeline, it wasn't soon enough. So Ed realizes, hey, I can be right and NASA can be right, because in the end, he's the one who chose to follow the mission. He stayed Oscar Mike on mission and chose to not land. But he is also going to support the idea that the current administration of NASA is not going to align with President Nixon's initiative to set up a military installation on the moon, because there's espionage that suggests that the Russians are doing the same.
Right.
They come across some blueprints through means that suggest the right, and they're obviously, given the nature of the beginning of the episode, just 2 months later launching and putting a woman on the moon, they're moving quickly. And
Right.
that's our indicator for our side of things, that we need to be moving quickly. And so, yeah, and he doesn't outright say Von Braun, was chicken, so to speak, but it's implied. And I don't want to. I don't want to read too much into the character that isn't explicit in the text. But you could make some assumptions about the character of Senator Sandman, given the casting of Saul Rubinek and his heritage, right? And to pit that against the next hearing we'll get into draws an interesting position,
Parable.
I think. Yeah.
Right.
Don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll
No,
come to that.
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, look, for the life of me, I don't understand. Just real quickly, and then we'll get on to hearing number two, which is the button, which is the one that this episode really explodes on. I really find it interesting how us as a human society, like a part of human society is explorers, like astronauts and people who fly planes and inventors and all that shit. But it's so fascinating to me how humans can explore wonderful, previously unexplored places of this earth, like space, for example. And if we ever get to actually attempt what for all mankind pictures here, which I do believe that we'll get to at some point in our history, but it's unbelievable to me that even when we get out there, we're gonna find people to fight out there.
Mhm.
So like the the constant the constant thing in all of humankind is that we we say that we don't want to fight with people, but the truth is, as a society, we find reasons to fight with people.
We do. We do. Humanity is not really great at looking past the differences that we see on the
Right,
surface
right,
of each other. And that causes an inherent conflict nature, I think.
right,
And, you know, when it comes to exploration, there are two motivations. There's the doing of it for the doing of it, right? There's really very little reason to go to Antarctica other than Antarctica exists, because we know enough before we go there that there's not a lot to find. But maybe there is. Like, there's a lot of science to do there. And then there's exploitive exploration, which the vast majority of the world has been subject to or participant in for, millennia, right? Every new territory humanity found on this planet, if there was somebody already there, we took it from them. So, and it's frustrating. You have the men of science, the people of science, the Margos and the Warners and the folks who are doing this for the doing of it, for the learning of it, who are constantly countered by the people who are doing for the winning of it, right?
Mhm.
Nixon doesn't give two poops about the
No, he doesn't
science
give a shit
behind
about
it.
it.
He wants to fight, right?
Right.
And he's like, oh, they're going to put some guns on the moon. We're putting guns on the moon too. Nobody's going to see this on Tricky Dick's watch. Well,
This
there you
public
go.
service announcement will see about Dan Decker.
That's right.
No, but yeah. Look. I mean, this episode really made me think about that, and really made me think about the frailty of humans. In that's our one flaw that a lot of us have,
Mhm.
and it's the one flaw that eventually leads to disastrous things for uh for for society in countless decades. But
Yep.
enough of me thinking about the poetic meanings of this episode. Let's get to the hearing of this episode. So, the same senator calls to bear the head of the astronaut program, and basically the head of NASA at this point, Warner Braun. And
Yep.
this hearing is basically to ask Warner about the moral implications of his rockets and his designs.
Yep.
So I'm not going to talk a lot about what happens in this hearing. I would like to turn it over to my fellow co-host Dan Decker to take us through the scene and to tell us what he thinks about it, because I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to hear what you have to say first.
This scene was really hard to watch simply because it was a subverted setup.
Yeah.
He was led into slaughter, and again, can't speak to text that isn't on the surface and being explicitly stated, but giving the casting of the actor to counter the nature of this hearing. Just like in real life, several tens, at least dozens more, maybe, of German Nazi scientists were, expatriated as part of a real life Operation Paperclip. Warner von Braun and a lot of his compatriots were part of that, and it was. If you watch this, he talks about how we hid our work in the hills because we chose to go with the Americans and hide from the Soviets. And that's all true history. Those are the things that really happened. These scientists picked a side, essentially, and it was a real world march towards these locations from the Russians coming, and our allies, but still, only because it's an enemy of my enemy situation. And so they're coming from the east, and Americans and the British are coming from the west, and it's whoever gets there first. Because again, remember, we expected that Germany had designs on the bomb, right? And if Germany had designs on the bomb and Russia beat us to it, they're going to get designs on the bomb. So that was the whole compulsion of this. And then again, they already exhibited the efficiency and the efficacy of delivering bombs with rockets. So there's another reason to get there first. But there was a significant cost of us, we as Americans, because it was classified. We didn't talk about what these scientists, how these scientists accomplished their work under Nazi Germany. Um, and I mean, if you know anything about scientific history in Nazi Germany, just go from there. However, and this is bared out in just the nature of the story in our history, that while he may not have been the one to say let's do it this way, or let's use these human beings as literal resources, enslaved labor, that um, he just kind of like, yeah, well, things need to get done, and so and that is real. That was how it really went down. But I mean, a lot of Americans did it too once he's on our team, right? Like,
Right.
he was scapegoated in this story.
He was
Uh,
railroaded.
yeah, and because they, the senator of note who was burned by Ed in the end, and so this is also somewhat could be seen as revenge seeking overall, to kind of win the day, because he wants NASA to be this hard charge and get it done organization. And so he sets von Braun up to be a notable, gets the crowd on his side by answering these questions. And he's hitting all the high notes, he's playing his hits. And then this guy decides, well, I'm going to unplug the PA. And they bring out the pictures, and they're like, hey, these were the workers the day we liberated the camp that made your rockets. Do they look like they were having a good time? And yeah, no, they embarrass him and shame him, arguably, maybe rightfully so, but not without any culpability on the part of the administrations that made it happen. What I would like to note, though, and they make a pretty prominent use of this anytime we go into the lobby of the NASA building, we see the three portraits on the wall, and it's Nixon, von Braun, and Payne.
Pain.
And after our hearing and the fallout from that, his picture's gone. And another one of those intrinsic ways to tell stories that are subtle and in there with the visual storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, this was a favorite. This was a favorite sequence of the whole episode, because I really thought that Warner was going to stick around for much longer,
Hmm.
and the way that they sort of the way that Ron and his other writers handled the story, I thought was really great, because um I think the scene really brings to bear the really intricate questions of, if you can do a thing, what are the causes? What are the true causes of you achieving greatness? Are
Yeah.
are you going to allow certain atrocities to happen because you want to achieve a goal?
Right.
And I think, listen, I think it's really clear that Von Braun in the For All Man timeline really decided to focus on his work over what he possibly knew what was going
Yes.
on just a little bit further down the road to where he was. But actually he made a great point in one of his final scenes with Margot in the viewing room
Hmm.
over a Mission Control. He was like, again, I'm paraphrasing here, guys, but he was like, "What the hell did you want me to do? It's either do what I was told, or I was going to end up with them. And if I ended up with them, all of my inventions and all the things that I helped create, and all the things that spurred this program that we're sitting in right now, wouldn't have existed."
Yep.
And Margot says something really interesting. She goes, "How do you know that?" And look, as far as the way that Margot reacts, I think it's completely justified.
Hmm.
But I'm thinking to myself, how could Margot have not known that this was a possibility? Do you think that do you think that she was so naive to the greatness of her idol that she didn't know that to create these wonderful to create these ingenious machines, he could have possibly paid a price, or he could have possibly made some interesting decisions?
Well, I think that speaks to obviously Margot is a trained and talented critical thinker, but we don't see what we don't want to see, right? And I would take that there probably wasn't a lot of discussion about how his work was done, because that would likely, given Margot would have been very young, probably
Right,
during World War II, because
right, right, right. She
she's
would have been
very
a
young in
kid.
this, yeah. And so, yeah, she has that idealistic, that idolized, that hero worship. Um, I want to draw two points here. Kind of flip back to when Margot got the job in
Right.
Mission Control. Warner gives her his slide rule,
That's so cool.
and if you know anything about an engineer and their slide rule, that is literally passing the torch, right?
Yep.
That is his. That is his. You have done well, right? Because, and I know this because my grandfather. Well, I have my grandfather's engineering scale, and it means a lot to me. And so
Oh,
that
cool.
that moment touched with me. But coming back to where we are now, there's a dark parallel here between Margot and Werner versus Karen and Tracy. They make the same demand of the opposite, in that, tell me you don't love him, and Margot says, tell me you didn't know, and he can't. Like, he equivocates on that answer, and it just says a lot about, like, I think Margot's kind of because later we see her using that slide rule. She's using it at her station, so she still admires this man, because I think she kind of realized, like you said, if she had looked, she would have seen it. And so
Mhm.
in her own, it's kind of like, well, you didn't tell me, but also, yeah, I probably should have seen it. So I think that's more of kind of a level of disappointment in herself too, but he won't tell her that he didn't know.
Yeah,
And
yeah, no, and there's a line that Warner says in that discussion when they're in the viewing room above Mission Control, which I love that room. I don't know what that room is called. It's just called the viewing room, right?
yeah, to us it is.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that room. Um, but there's I to me it's the line of the episode. Warner says, he basically says, progress always has a cost.
Yep.
And I love that line because it's true.
Yep.
True progress always hurts. And
Well,
people who are in the way always get hurt no matter
yep.
what happens.
Well, there this is a kind of a surface level, given the somewhat inconsequential nature of space travel. Like, the ethical questions are still there about how the work was done, how the research was done, and those. But you take it to another part of that time period, and Nazi Germany, and the doctors were doing the experiments and the torturous research that they were doing on people, and the ethical question being, is it ethical to use the science that was learned in the torture of human beings? Because
Mhm.
we learned a lot. So it's kind of in that same vein with this, like, benefiting from the absolute suffering of your fellow
Yeah,
human. It's going to happen one way or the other. Like, it's happening right now in the real world. If you're using a device with a lithium ion battery, someone's out there suffering to bring you the cobalt that makes that battery,
right.
you know? So,
But listen, I'm not, I do think it depends on I do think it depends on the individual who is making the choices,
yep.
because I don't know. Listen, I don't know if I was in a situation like that. I don't know if I would be able to make the right choice. Although, listen,
There's a
like,
level
okay,
of self-preservation that you
yeah,
have
yeah,
to acknowledge.
yeah, yeah. I'm so happy. I'm so happy you said it. There's a level of self-preservation that you have to acknowledge, and you have to make the best decision for you in that moment.
Yep.
Because if you don't, you're possibly going to lose your life, and that's the end of the ballgame.
And he's pretty egotistical, so he's gonna shade real close to Warner von Braun and not everybody else when he's
Right.
deciding what to do to as far as self-preservation goes.
Right.
But the dynamic between these two characters, between Margot, I wish we had more of it,
Yeah, it
because
was.
it's very compelling. But again, leaning off of the fact that he's already an interesting real world character. There's not much more that we can develop in this
With him.
world with him, right?
Yeah. Listen. I am kind of sad that he actually just shows up a few more times in this season. I think he shows up maybe once or twice in season 2, if I'm not
Yeah, she
mistaken.
goes to confront him at some point, but we'll come to that when the episode rolls up.
We'll definitely come to that. But wrapping up our discussion on episode 2 now, I would like to revisit with our favorite. Well, for right now, she's not my favorite because right now she's just a kid and she's pissing me off. Let's just to be clear, Aleda, older Aleda is awesome. Younger Aleda, not so much.
She's a struggle.
So let's catch up with younger Aleda, and her father and Aleda are in the U.S. now, and they're living in a house full of Spanish folks with people basically in every room.
Right.
And Aleda is getting the habit, like I said last episode, of setting shit on fire.
Yeah.
She
literally a little pyro.
Yeah. And she really doesn't know why. And I'm going to just put together 2 quick scenes at this point. So the first scene is Aleda and her father is trying to confront her and ask her, what's going on? Why are you doing this shit? And Aleda basically starts speaking to her father in Spanish. And her father goes, only English. And Aleda cannot come up with a logical answer as to why she's setting shit on fire. Nope. There's another sequence towards the end of the episode where Aleda is reading what happened to Warner von Braun in a newspaper. And she burns the newspaper. And because she burns the newspaper, other shit in the room catches on fire. Her father comes in. And then we have the revelation that Aleda says she wants to set fires because she wants to be in the fire. Yeah. And that shit doesn't make sense. No. That shit makes you really concerned.
A little concerning, yeah.
So I really, really like Aleda's I really like the pathway that Aleda's father takes. He basically tells her the story of why they were there. And then he takes her to a place where he works, which is convenient.
Yeah.
There's convenience. He happens to be working at the NASA Space Center.
Yep.
And he takes her to a model of a rocket on the grounds. And he says, perhaps one day you'll set a fire in one of these.
Yeah.
And I love that moment because I think that is the character twist. I think that's the defining character moment for Aleda. Because I'm like, her seeing that rocket and her seeing what she can do to that rocket, I think changed her life. And I think if her father didn't take her to see that rocket at that specific time, I think that Aleda would have turned out to be much worse.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I really kind of I'd forgotten this part about her character, and so being reminded of it and kind of trying to understand her desire, like you said, she's literally says, I want to be in the fire, and it draws back to, I think, the last time right before they leave Mexico and come to across the river, the last thing she does is set a candle. Right. So she starts a fire for her mother and then leaves. And I think that maybe we don't know her history much before that. Was she a little pyro before mom died? We don't know. But the last thing she does. And so I would say the fire reminds her of her mother, and then just wanting to be, because the last time, when we saw the moon landing, she was there being held by her mother as part of that experience. So I think that she might see that as some way, or kind of relate those two things. If I were looking for an emotional, if I were writing the story, that would be my behind the scenes take on it. But yeah, her father redirecting her, as we see, he's a janitor at the place where everybody else works, which eventually leads to her endpoint. But taking her to that rocket and showing her there's a way to direct this energy. If you want, you can design fire, essentially, right? But what caught me in that moment is, comparatively to them standing next to that rocket looks kind of big. It's kind of big. But what about it versus the Saturn V, and you see this thing and still look at it with the little people standing on the ground, and then that put someone into space, though, right? That was like the rocket that would have been similar to the rocket that Shepard or Glenn flew on, right? So to see them so tiny standing there to such an actually big thing, but knowing that the one the show's really about is so much bigger.
Yeah.
And they drop an Easter egg in this as well. And it's the beginning of Von Braun's hearing when he thinks he's still winning like, the Fancy Dan at the recent Kentucky Derby. He thinks he's doing okay. And he talks about what we see at what is the kind of the cliffhanger for the end of this season and it's not a spoiler, but it's a Sea Dragon rocket. So he's talking about that Sea Dragon, not by name, but by design at the beginning of that hearing. He's like, and the next rocket will lead us and, it'll launch X amount into space and it'll be great. And so that's kind of it's one of those things that we get because we've already seen the show. Like that's the real Easter eggs that we know because the little setups that we can't remember when we got there. And I was like, good job, guys.
Yeah. Listen. The character work that this episode does, I think. Listen, we love the pilot here. I think that's not. I think that's not down for debate. But I do think that this episode just layers the universe that much more and just pushes the story, at least for season 1, in very, very interesting ways. And when I was watching this episode when it initially aired, I had no idea what was going to happen. I had no idea what was going to happen next. And I'm sure that was the case for a lot of people who were watching this series when it initially aired, whether you knew a lot about the space program or you didn't. But bringing this bringing this discussion to a close, Dan, if the folks at home want to reach out to you and talk to you on social media about For All Mankind, what would be the best place for them to do that?
Well, Instagram probably. Facebook is also out there. I'm on Blue Sky, and all of these things you can find on my Linktree. So head over to Linktree/DECKER. I'm sorry, DECKR Media, like it's spelled here on the title card, and you should be able to find everything I'm up to. Links back to the projects that Marcelo and I've worked on, my YouTube channel, et cetera, and so on. So come find me.
All right, guys. So if you're interested in learning about real space history, go to Dan because he's one of the best that I know who does that. So just go to him and ask him all the questions you want, but politely, of course. But but if you guys want to catch me and my adventures online, you can catch me on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, but now it's called X. I'm at Creek Fanatic 88. So if you want to chat with me there about For All Mankind or anything else, you're welcome to. But until next time, for my fellow co-host, Dan Decker, I would just like to say thank you for listening to us, and we'll catch you next time.
You won't catch Tricky Dick.
So much happened here, and so much is about to.